So it's so wonderful to be back here on Whadjuk Budja, so I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation today. I'm originally from Western Australia. I'm a graduate of the WA Academy of Performing Arts. I moved over here to Sydney 2 years ago to take up a job that I currently do at the Australia Council for the Arts, where I'm the Director of Experimental Art and Community Arts. It's a very wonderful job that I feel very lucky to have, and I get to meet wonderful people like joining me on stage today. So I sort of did a lot of the early parts of my career here in Western Australia. I've worked with the Perth Festival, Bark and Gecko, Awesome Data, and primarily as a creative producer, particularly in a lot of regional communities across Western Australia. But as a lighting designer, did a lot of independent work and worked with a few of the local theatre companies in unusual locations, and did a lot of outdoor and experimental works in that sort of part of my career. I was very old school, where I sort of didn't use many moving or electronic lights and hand drew a lot of my plans. And interestingly, I recently put a post up on Instagram, which Georgia, the executive producer, commented on. It was a photo of a DVD, and she said, "How vintage." And I can proudly say that I've never watched a thing on any of the online platforms or anything like that. So I've never seen an episode of Game of Thrones. I'm Tyrion enough. And a lot of my work too has been diversity focused. I've worked with young people and other people, groups of people with disabilities, our First Nations communities in the Kimberley and others as well. So, I wanted to start by letting each of rather than doing a formal structured introduction, I figure we've got some amazing people joining me today, so I'm going to let each of them do a 5-minute introduction about themselves, their practice, and their connection to the theme that we're going to be exploring today. So I'll begin with James Brennan.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on and pay my respects to the elders, past and present, before I show this intense video. Bang. So what you're looking at is a work I made in 2013. It consists of hundreds of faces of people who were taken into police custody in USA. The reason I'm able to use these photos is because they're all in public domain. That means I can get them really easily on the internet. The reason why I choose to use them, despite not having the permission of all these individuals, is because I hope to subvert the dehumanising effect of what I think the authors of these photos were intending. That is, to expose and stigmatise these subjects as criminal and as other. So I've sort of used the content of the system I'm challenging in order to challenge it. This is a big part of my current artistic practice. I'm an independent artist. I work in experimental performance, music and video, mostly as a director and a composer, but also as a performer and a writer. I make theatre every 3 to 5 years because it's hard, it takes time. And in between, I'm usually making music. As a composer and a performer, I move freely between a lot of genres, electronic music, death metal, and various forms of classical and folk music. In recent years, my artistic practice has focused directly on criminal justice. So since 2014, I've led a project called The Chat, which is a performance work which was created and performed by artists and former prisoners. It's been presented at Arts House in La Boîte and will be presented at a major festival in Australia next year. It's a big project. It's got a lot of streams to it. I won't go into them all, but one of them is a research which I've been presenting at criminology conferences in Australia and overseas. And the results of this will be published in a book co-authored by myself and my collaborating criminologist, Dr. Anna Eriksson from Monash. I'm in the early stages of setting up music programs and a recording studio in prison in Tasmania, and I've recently opened a feminist library in Hobart with my partner in crime and life, Willow S. Wyland, with whom I also co-curated FOMO, which is the nighttime part of Mona FOMO Festival this year. My focus is on making high-quality experimental works of art in collaboration with former and current prisoners. They're experimental in their content and their form, and I try to move them beyond existing conventions around socially engaged artwork. I enjoy playing with conventional ideas of risk, of agency, and of identity. The results in the work so far have been pretty compelling and have spawned some collaborations with academic criminologists, corrective services, and individuals with lived experience. Today I want to talk about, mostly in this context of our discussion, a work called Judith's Return, which is, because it reflects the theme best. It's a video work that I've made in partnership with a prison in Poland since 2013. It combines an original operatic score that I composed with my collaborator in Poland with panoramic video, which is sort of my version of surround, sort of VR world in the 2D crappy film version of that, because I don't know how to do VR. It's narrated by 9 male prisoners and shot simultaneously on 3 cameras in Poland on location. It's part of a long-term project to do 7 films in 7 prisons on 7 virtues in 7 different countries. The work will premiere inside the prison in Poland, and the audience will be the prisoners who participated and other prisoners and staff. I see it as a sort of virtual escaping of the prisoners. Before creating my first work in 2000, I wrote a short manifesto. I would not make work in conventional theatres, I would not charge money, and I would make the location secret. The theme of today, so the theme is pretty familiar to me. In a way, I want to move past the theme, but I'll start by saying what I'm interested in about the theme. I'm interested in how we own and inhabit the role of the artist and how that might be changing. I mean, us as artists. In recent years, my chosen collaborators have widened to include former prisoners and criminologists. I've invited them to take on certain roles that I or other artists might have otherwise done in order to create a richer, more nuanced artwork. In this sense, I might reframe this theme today from taking art out of the gallery to taking art off the artist. What I mean by that is about removing or changing the roles and responsibility and the exclusive ownership of the artistic process by the artists themselves. I think we are in times where art from outsiders or non-conventional artists is often as compelling as art by established artists. Recent exhibition at Mona called the Museum of Everything. I don't know if anyone saw that. Yeah, amazing, huge collection from what curators referred to as untrained, unintentional, undiscovered and unclassifiable artists. It was a powerful collection. I was blown away. It reminded me again of the deeper function of making art. There was such a palpable sense of purpose in all of the works. A good example in Australia of untrained artists making amazing work is back-to-back theatre. I know it's mentioned all the time, but I think it's a good example for today. They are, by the way, the only professional full-time theatre ensemble in the country. They make work with neurodivergent, I think is how you call it, neurodiverse, yeah. Neurodiverse and disabled people. But the amazing thing, it's not on the website when you look about them. They're just a theatre company when you go on there. It's part of the thing I really love about them. They're also making extraordinary work, and they are one of our greatest artistic exports. That's still probably correct. Returning to the theme and finishing up, the question of who does the taking, who does the changing, and who does the handing over of these tasks I was talking about, I think is an important question today. I think the answer to that is such decisions have to remain with the artist. And I hope we try to do that as artists in our role, even when it feels really precarious and uncertain, like it does now. If we don't do it, someone else probably will take those roles off us. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, James. As the pointer makes its way down the panel, we come to our next speaker, Natalie Marinho.
Clicking?
Yep.
Oh, no, that's...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. So my name is Natalie, thanks Jeremy. I am an augmented reality designer, so I'm coming to this panel from the tech perspective. and I am founder of a company based out in Fremantle called Voyant AR. So my academic background started in psychology and anthropology, where I was I studied anthropology and psychology, where I was interested in people and the way that we perceive the world and how we interact and build relationships with the people around us. I later studied international relations, which I realised was quite similar in that it's the way that we construct our identities through the idea of a nation state and countries, and how we identify with the place that we've been born, and how politics and geography play into that construction of identity. This led me to work in international aid and development, where I worked on projects in deploying technology in developing countries like Kiribati and Solomon Islands, where I lived for 3 months. And what really was transformative about that experience was I learnt that technology can really enhance the lives of people, but you really have to understand the human element and how that technology is going to be used. And not just in the design, but also in the way it's delivered, and then how it's used on an ongoing basis. So from them, I started to delve more into digital content and digital media. So from everything from blogs to vlogs, the emergence of social media as a way of communicating and connecting with other people, to more emerging technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality, which I'm sure we're going to go into more detail later. And what's really exciting is that just over a year ago, I founded Voyant AR. So we're a creative studio based out of Fremantle. We create bespoke augmented reality experiences for mobile applications. One of the projects that we're working on at the moment is a messaging app in AR that's going to be released to the App Store in a month or two, called Drop It. And a longer term project is working with street artists to convert traditional 2D kinds of art forms into a 3D context, and then later into augmented reality. So I'll tease that for now and leave more for later. So, yeah.
Thanks, Natalie. Our final speaker is Zoe Pepper.
Hey. So I'm a writer and director. I work in theatre, and then more recently I've been working in film. And I also kind of create work that is interactive audio-based work, which is really where the tech element comes into my practice. So I guess, like a lot of artists, I'm really eclectic in my approach to work, and I work very traditionally in theatre in as well as, my practice spans from directing plays that somebody else has written to creating works that's app-based and audio-driven. And it's more about finding the form that's the best way to tell the story, rather than being kind of fascinated by technology and driven to kind of integrate technology into my work. It's still about the story as kind of like the fundamental part of what's driving me to create stories. And so really I am interested in sound and the capabilities of sound to have an emotional connection with the audience, and that there's something really seductive about being in an audience's ear, and kind of the power that has in terms of deepening the empathetic experience and strengthening the audience's connection with the story. And so it was through that fascination that I've really kind of then explored the tools that I can use to implement that in my practice, which I then created a work called The Confidence Man, which was an interactive audio work where 6 audience members play the characters in the story, and they put on headphones and they hear the instructions that kind of guide them through the story to play the part, which was really a way to kind of break down the form of what a story can be, and that it's told from 6 different perspectives, as well as kind of get right in the audience's ear and, for want of a better word, manipulate them emotionally to kind of like really come on this ride with us. And then, the audio has been a really key thread in my practice for like the last 10 years. And so more recently I made a show called The Irresistible, which played at Pika last year. Which was a show that we wanted to make about unconscious bias. And we kind of had these grand notions of, going in there being like, yeah, we've done all our research, we're going to make this show about unconscious bias. And then we're presented with the really tough reality that you're trying to make a show about something that you can't see and that you can't really understand what your own unconscious biases are to then be able to tell a story about them. And so technology really kind of like found its way into that process by wanting to have a discussion about unconscious bias without it being kind of a flag-waving intellectual discussion. We wanted to find a way where we kind of exposed the audience's own unconscious bias or our own unconscious biases in the process of making it. And that's where we used technology by modulating the voices of the actors on stage so that they could flick between being a female character or a male character, and that kind of process of an ever-evolving character that kind of had no real buffers in terms of scene starts and finishes meant that the words that were coming out of an actor's mouth, whether there was a female voice or a male voice, and the way that you engaged with what that actor was saying kind of exposed biases in myself where I thought the female actress was being a bit of a nag, and then I turned her into a male voice and I thought, oh no, she's actually being quite reasonable. And then I was like, oh, isn't that just the worst? So it was then trying to put that into a story and kind of give the audience that experience. So technology was a really kind of key part of that. And I'll give it back to Jeremy.
Oh, thank you. Panel, thank you. I think I'm hashtag fangirling, so can we please give our panel a warm welcome? And they were all quite modest. If you had a mantelpiece to accommodate the awards and accolades that each of these guys have won, you'd need something the size of this stage here to accommodate all of that. So we're very privileged and lucky to have all these guys joining us today. So with that, we'll get underway. We've got about 40 minutes for a bit of a facilitated conversation. And, we're going to try and sort of just explore all sorts of places over this. I've got some questions here prepared, but we'll see how we go. And at the end, we'll allow hopefully around 15 minutes for some Q&A. So as you're going through and hear offerings from each of our speakers, make a note and have a chat to us at the end of the session. It was a bit serendipitous when Georgia Malone asked me to facilitate this session that in my inbox an article appeared about the story of Daniel Birnbaum. And he is the outgoing director of the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, which is the Museum of Modern Art, and he was the artistic director of the 53rd Venice Biennale in 2009. The headline and strapline of the article read, "This could really be art for all, while Daniel Birnbaum is leaving his job as a museum director for a career in VR. The esteemed director of the Moderna Museet is moving on to become the artistic director of the VR production company Acute Art." And I'll just share with you a bit of an excerpt from the article which was on ArtNet. "Having launched in 2017, Acute Art has built its reputation on producing virtual reality artworks for artists including Marina Ambrinovic, Anish Kapoor, Oliver Eliasson, Jeff Koons, and most recently Christo. Alongside its role as a producer of digital artworks, Acute Art is also a research hub and curatorial laboratory committed to giving artists access to the most cutting-edge technologies and exploring new ways to reach audiences with digital art. In this newly created role, Daniel will focus on identifying opportunities to continue bringing digital artwork to the public, both within an institutional framework and online through a curated offer on Acute Art's website and app. He will deepen the company's ongoing commitment to realising artistic vision in digital mediums by collaborating with and commissioning artists, directing the company's exhibiting program and establishing and leading the expert research hub focused on the future use of technologies in artistic practice. Mr. Birnbaum said, "I have had the great privilege to lead one of the best art schools, an exemplary museum of modern art, and the most legendary of biennales. It is therefore a good moment to leave the old institutional world and move into an unknown territory. Acute Art is a new kind of institution and is fast becoming a leader in the field of art and technology. This move marks an adventure, a journey into the future. He recently pointed out at the New York Times Art Leaders Conference in Berlin that virtual reality, or VR, as a whole was still in its Stone Age period. And with that, we'll open up our first question. Panel, the Stone Age lasted for something like 3.4 million years. So let's hope we move a little bit swifter. But I just wanted to sort of initially throw out there and just see for you, each of you, can you see where Daniel's coming from? I guess he's specifically talked about virtual reality in the Stone Age, but I guess we can sort of expand that more into sort of art and technology more broadly. How do you feel about those remarks about the Stone Age and this space?
Well, from a technical point of view, I mean, virtual reality hasn't been around for that long, probably a few decades, but I guess what we're seeing is the accessibility of that technology opening up to more and more people. So could I just maybe see a show of hands of people that have actually had an experience in VR or tried a headset? Yeah, that's really cool. You wouldn't have seen that obviously 10 years ago, but I think with the advent of technology like Google Cardboard, that's really cheap and accessible and a lot of people can use, and even through their smartphones, it's come a long way. But in terms of a field for experimentation and pushing the limits of what's possible, I think that has a long way to go. I think we're very early.
Yeah, I mean, I read the article, and I just found myself sort of instinctively suspicious of this guy. And I think it was the line which jumped out at me was where he was just saying, you know, VR for all, you know, to the slums with the VR, you know. And I wondered if it was a purely VR person saying that, I don't think I would have the same suspicion. But given his history, and he's coming to VR with this artistic perspective, you know, and there's certain protocols and values around art making, which I'm sure he must carry if he's been in those positions. So it's
interesting that he's also led a teaching institution as well, I guess. So
exactly,
that whole trajectory. Yeah,
it struck me as, you know, I think I'm suspicious of him wanting to make this experience ubiquitous and just like omnipresent was his language. Omnipresent. I'm like, what is that? What's that mean? And it smacked of sort of marketing more than bringing some of the, you know, diverse and really dynamic values of art making to VR, which I'm sure is what he's doing. So I'm not sure, I couldn't peg him, but I did have my suspicions about his approach, and, you know, there was no mention of, you know, what figures he got offered to, why did he move from the thing, he didn't say anything about that. I would have loved to have been a bit more transparent about his move. But in saying that, sure, bring VR to the slums, but make sure it's, you know, not too flashy.
Together, yes.
Yeah, not too flashy. I kind of hope VR's in the Stone Age and that we're going to move into something that's kind of like big and wonderful that's still to come. And in terms of art, I find that there's still a disconnect between when you read about something on the page and it sounds like this mind-blowing experience that you're just, you know, it reads fabulously, and then you get to actually do it and you're like, oh, I'm just looking at my phone, aren't I? And so when we can like move to where the dream of how it reads on the page kind of matches up to the actual experience, I think that's when we'll have moved out of the Stone Age. Yeah, I'm a little, as we were talking about earlier, I'm a little gun-shy around VR as someone who got extremely nauseous from putting on the VR headset. I'm looking forward to when it progresses into something that doesn't make me want to vomit, which is a bit great.
Natalie, just quickly, and you sort of alluded to it, do you want to just give us a quick 101 on your sort of key takeouts in terms of AR and VR?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. For those people in the audience who haven't had a chance, virtual reality usually works in the form of some kind of really chunky headset or something really small like a Google Cardboard viewer that you can put your phone in, but as a standalone headset, it's usually plugged into a really powerful computer. And when you put the headset on, basically you experience full 100% immersion. So you have a 360-degree view around you of a completely artificial virtual environment. And sometimes, depending on the system that you're using, you'll have some degree of autonomy and control. So you can move your head around, but it will also, depending on the system, track where you're moving and the direction that you're facing. And you may also have controllers in your hands so that the system also recognises movements, and then you can interact with objects that are in that world. And the close cousin to virtual reality is augmented reality, which is placing virtual content or digital content over the real world. And the best known example, although I'm loath to use it, is Pokemon Go. So you use the lens of your camera or your tablet to look at the world around you, and you can see virtual objects, or in that case, pocket monsters, interacting and jumping all over the place in the world. And I think as technology increases and processing power and computing gets better, you'll be able to see that technology actually lies on a spectrum, so that on one end you have virtual reality, which is 100% complete immersion, and then when you dial it back, you get closer to augmented reality and you have some degree of control and filtering over what virtual content, until you just get back to real reality on the other end of the spectrum. So.
Thank you. I'll stick with you, Natalie, just quickly. I sort of saw when I was researching some background for this conversation that John Lasseter, who he directed Toy Story and is the Chief Creative Officer at Disney Animation and Pixar, recently made the point that ever-evolving animation tools are just that, tools, not the primary driver of the art. And he spelt out his own philosophy on the matter as follows, that art challenges technology and technology inspires art. And so with that in mind, I just wanted you to talk about through, since you've sort of come online with Voyant, what are you discovering, or how are you helping artists to discover, what they can do with these technologies? And I guess what have you seen in terms of these, having access to these new mediums, changing their ideas of artistic utopia?
So predominantly 3D content or digital art has been made by people who have very specialised skill set and experience with computer programs and software. So they're really building these things with, either a mouse or a tablet and a stylus, and that's how artwork has been created in terms of 3D models and animation and content that's suitable for a VR environment. But what's really exciting, and it's happened more recently, is that there are more tools becoming available for artists who work in traditional means, so things like sculpture and illustration and painting, to be able to interact with VR using those kinds of tools that they're more familiar with as a medium. And so one of the projects that we're working on at the moment is with street artists, so Perth-based street artists who are more traditional in painting murals and artworks on walls and outside. And we're using VR tools to help them translate that traditionally two-dimensional artwork into a 3D environment. And so I think those kinds of tools are emerging for traditional artists, but also other kinds of storytellers and content creators, so that it shouldn't, and I feel this as well, it shouldn't just be the realm of people who are really techie or, software developers. It should be open to everybody, so that everyone or anyone can create content.
Thank you. We'll start bringing in James maybe to this conversation here, and I just wanted to speak briefly about a couple of really profound VR experiences that I'd have in the last 18 months, the highlights being Lynette Walworth's Collisions, which was at Pika during the 2017 Perth Festival, and more recently Laurie Anderson's Chalk Room at the 2018 Dark Mofo Festival in Hobart. And both of those, as VR experiences go, and as applications of that technology, were very different ends of the VR spectrum, I guess. One was very episodic and narrative-based, and the other was completely user-driven and interactive, immersive, and choose-your-own-adventure-like. So, but one thing I found about both experiences was that they were perhaps a little lonely. Just me in my own VR world, but when you consider things like reading a book or listening to music, that's a sort of solo experience too. So James and Natalie, I wanted to ask you both, as two people working in VR at different ends of the spectrum. Either James, I think you're beginning to sort of dip a toe into those waters as an artist currently developing a VR work, or Natalie, someone who is creating the opportunities for artists and audiences to experience work in this realm. Where does the user experience fit in that sort of frame, I guess, you know, do you prefer the lonesome or solo experience, or are you aiming for something eventually more communal or collaborative?
I saw the work. I really want to talk about the lonely thing. I saw the Laurie Anderson work you saw, and I was blown away. It was a very moving experience, and also a very high-end techno experience, where the quality of the world was so real. I was walking up very close to the surfaces of the walls to check that it was what I thought it was. It was so beautiful and so vivid and tangible. The loneliness part of it is interesting. I think that's part of what was moving, actually. But I'm about to start a work which is a VR work around suicide prevention. And when I consider the idea that part of the beauty of it is very lonely, it's kind of pretty intense. I've not worked in suicide field before, though I've worked with a lot of people who've had lived experience of it, but I haven't worked directly with it. One of the things we're interested to do is, and we're at the very beginning of the process at the moment, I'm in consultation stage, and it's going to be a very sort of slow process to make sure that we are engaging in an appropriate way with the people we're working with. I'm going to run a workshop with about 5 suicide survivors to begin that, and I'm going to think about what you said about the loneliness part. One of the things we're trying to do is, some of the ideas we've had are around using some of the existing strategies that are out there around suicide prevention and from the individuals that we work with to see if we can unravel, populate the virtual world in a way with objects, tasks, opportunities, aesthetics that I speak poetically to these strategies. It's not a therapeutic tool. We're very clearly trying to avoid approaching it in that way. We are, in a very sort of forthright way, stating to ourselves and our collaborators that this is a poetic response to the problem of suicide. I assume that as a symptom and a result of that also, that we will possibly have some great results in terms of the outcomes for individuals involved. I hope that is exclusively the case. It's a precarious field to be working in with such sort of vivid material. So anyway, it's my first sort of venture into VR. After that, my intention is to try and make VR for returning prisoners.
Wow.
Yeah.
Natalie, did you?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think it's something that I guess the artist can decide what they want to experience.
Context of the work and the
and whether
application,
maybe loneliness is something, you know, the theme that they want to explore. But I'm quite excited about the potential for a more collaborative experience and like a multiplayer experience, which is what a lot of video games are currently exploring with VR as well, as that multiplayer experience. And I think it's also something that's very different between VR and AR, in that VR tends to be a kind of solo one-person experience, but a lot of augmented reality experiences really rely on multiple people coming together. And when I refer to the Pokemon Go experience, I'm sure you all saw, you know, when it came out roughly 2 years ago, you know, clusters of people walking around through Kings Park together. But it was an experience that they could only have together and in those locations. And that's what really was interesting about the title of today's panel, you know, taking art out of the gallery. Something that we're exploring, and with those street artists, is the idea of location-based content, and how do you extend a context or a layer of meaning because you are in that place at that time with those people.
Can I ask about that group experience of Pokemon Go?
Sure.
I heard people say that a lot. You know, look, they're all in groups having a great time together. Were you engaging with that angle?
Personally, as a player, I did. Yeah, I did. We would. When I was working at that point in the company in the CBD, we would often arrange to go out for walks together, you know, either before or afterwards, and it became kind of a way of facilitating, you know, interactions and discussions.
Were you on the thing?
Yeah, but you were kind of talking as you were walking around.
But you were never outside. You were not ever going, oh my God, these weirdos on the phones. You were in.
No, I was in that experience. So I guess I was coming at it from an insider. But one not issue, but one thing I'd like to say about the Pokemon Go experience is that it is a game, so it's a closed system.
Yeah.
And so there are prescribed behaviours and interactions that you can have with other people. So you're only playing in a game, whereas I think there's so much more opportunity to explore with just communicating with other people and having a more open way of interacting with other people that's not, so prescriptive as a game that somebody else has built. Like, the idea of user-generated content and things that people can contribute.
Is there in the VR world like sort of protocols and ethics that everybody understands around the importance or value of physical contact? Or, Jeremy mentioned before that how long you should stay inside VR. You shouldn't stay in there forever, I assume.
Well, to Zoe's point earlier, it depends on the individual. Like if physically there are constraints, we tend to only work in VR for like 20 to 30 minutes. We find that that's probably best for your eyes, but also people lose track of time and space when you're in there. You don't have access to your watch necessarily, so you don't know how much time's gone by. But as Jeremy said earlier, we're in the Stone Age, so as far as I know, there is no official kind of rule book for how one should approach it or what one's building. So, which is an exciting thing for us to explore.
Yeah.
Right? So.
You mentioned earlier that it makes you feel a bit nauseous as well after a time, and I'm curious as to whether that is a troubling thing on some level, that you're working in a field that you can't do for more than half an hour without feeling a bit sick.
Yeah, I think it's probably not so much now, but earlier when the software and the technology hadn't come that far, and I think wearing glasses is probably a constraint sometimes as well. But again, I think it's about the experiences that we're building in there. But that's something definitely to think about as creators, that we have to think of those constraints as well as for us creating those experiences.
James, I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on your incredible introduction. I mean, your track record and your practice is really incredible. I've heard artists talk about the bureaucracy of art making and the restrictions that come with making art in traditional spaces. There are biases and preconceptions of working in what is commonly referred to as a theatre. And I loved how you said in one of our recent calls is that theatre didn't come from theatre. So I just wanted to sort of you to talk about from your own perspective. I'm sure, much of your practice has changed, intensified, or in fact, perhaps stayed the same with some of the issues that you're looking at. Can you tell us about how the purpose of your art making has shifted?
Sure, I'll try. I think deciding to work in criminal justice field was the sort of genesis of a big shift. And I think what happened was it forced me to really consider what I was doing, what I was trying to achieve, how I was doing it, and was it going to work? The was it going to work bit sort of important if you're working in a socially engaged field, in my opinion. When you're just going to make a piece of art and you sort of follow your nose and hope for the best and making something beautiful, which could have been my methodology prior, and that's good. I think art for art's sake is okay. It's good. James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause principle is fine and should be protected and valued in an artistic context. But when I decided to shift into criminal justice focus, I couldn't do that any longer. I was responsible for other people. Ideas of risk and safety, of ethics, all these things just started to flood in, and it took me years to really be comfortable with even beginning my first work. And so that was the genesis. But once I got there, I realised that once I'd worked all this stuff out and I built a methodology, the main difference I find probably now is that I'm able to justify what I'm doing on more than one level. And I don't think I could have done that as clearly prior to beginning my work working with people who'd been in prison. So, I think it's about the purpose was there before, but it was a little bit James Dean, and now it's, I don't know if anyone's got another actor who might be suitable parallel there, but it's good. I'm glad I can justify what I'm doing. I think that it's some language used by artists around purpose and risk and being radical is too easily used. And if historically we're probably not that good at critically analysing our own and each other's practices and what we're doing and whether it's working. So I have been in the process of working a lot of that stuff out for myself, and it's great, now I can walk into a situation, a very risky situation, with working with people who are in, very problematic personal scenario, and I feel fine taking those sort of artistic risks that I'm interested in, because I worked out what I was trying to do and how I was going to do it and whether it was going to work. So purpose has changed pretty dramatically for me, yeah.
Thanks. Zoe, did you, I guess you sort of said in your introduction too, you've sort of, branched out from theatre to film and screen-based work, and have you noticed, obviously within your own changes and patterns of working and those of your colleagues, shifts that have sort of, what is driving people to sort of explore these new territories than what they've traditionally worked in?
I think I can't talk about what's driving other people. For me, it's about, I guess it's twofold in terms of coming up with a story and then thinking about what's the best way to tell that story, whether it's episodic or in a theatrical context or purely audio driven. And then also the driver for me about working in mediums other than theatre is about having an audience. And I think that probably is just part of being from Perth and making work in Perth, in that it's a little bit of like, if a tree falls in the forest, does it ever really fall? And so working in film and working in mediums that are kind of more easily transportable is very appealing on that level, as far as being able to have an audience that exists beyond the physical season of the work. Yeah.
Yeah. And what has surprised you? You sort of touched on the sort of manipulation of your audience through your more recent works. What has surprised you most in terms of the response to that? And I guess, because what you've done in a lot of your practice is democratise what the notion is of a performance space and blurred that line between a traditional sit-down audience and on stage and whatnot. What's the biggest surprise you've had about the response?
I guess the most welcome surprise is how oblivious people are to the technology in a lot of my work, in that it looks really lo-fi from the outside, and that the mechanics and the technology are really invisible, because for me, the use of that technology is about facilitating a more human experience and creating a level of connection that you wouldn't necessarily have without that technology. So in, say, the show The Irresistible, where we had the live voice modulation and all the performers were holding remote controls where they changed their own voices, but that the majority of audience members didn't even notice that they had these remote controls in their hand, and they were engaged in the story and emotionally connecting with what was happening in front of them, rather than kind of like trying to unpick how the tech was working or what the mechanics were of what they were experiencing. And for me, that's really important, that it's about that emotional connection, and it's about using technology to create something that's more human rather than less human.
Cool. And as I said in my introduction, I work for the Australian Council for the Arts, and I sort of oversee Council's relationship with the community arts and cultural development sector and emerging and experimental arts sector. And both these fields within Australia are very interdisciplinary, and one of the greatest strengths is the way that artists, arts workers and organisations partner with other sectors or communities to use arts in non-conventional ways, and then more importantly, often in different settings. Some recently released research out of Council says that creative practice is now taking 57% of work time for artists, but is generating 39% of income. And half of the artists surveyed are applying their creative skills outside of the arts, which is up a third from 2009. And so I guess through your work, Natalie, you're sort of opening up new opportunities for artists. And do you think the skills and the engagement with technology is helping artists generally to be smarter and more entrepreneurial and better akin to collaborating with other people and sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from my experience of working with them, not necessarily from like an artist perspective, but I feel like any exposure or development in new skills and in technology, I would hope opens up a new way for them to see their own work and how it can be, how their own style could be adapted to, different formats. One thing that's been really interesting about creating digital work or virtual objects is that we, in the future, will be able to place those objects in the real world, and you'll be able to see them through your tablet or through your phone. And it's interesting that it kind of disrupts the creation and the manufacturing of that art, if you're talking about a physical sculpture or a painting, because there's no logistics involved. You don't have to, pack it down and set it up and, send it somewhere and then reinstall it. It's not going to be, especially in the case of street art, susceptible to, weather or damage or, people repainting over, famous street art, which has happened, due to ignorance or, vandals. So I think that's really interesting. From an entrepreneurial point of view, I think it's probably most disruptive in the way that content is shared and distributed and how people have access to it. So I'd be really interested to hear from your points of view about how, is that a good thing that more people can access it, and how do you get paid, and questions like that face artists.
Whoops.
Getting paid, good question.
Getting paid,
yeah.
geez.
Yeah. Sorry.
We had a conversation earlier which was about artworks existing in places like, say, in Times Square or something like that. And for me, I still struggle to wrap my head around that in terms of how that experience lives up to seeing an actual piece of work, and also how that I feel like we are just at the beginning in terms of people accessing that work, and the audience that have, the people who have access to VR headsets and that kind of thing is quite limited at this point. So it's really exciting to see how that advances and how accessible that becomes. And I feel like there will be a turning point where it does kind of rival experiencing an art in a physical space, but at this point it feels kind of early days.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested. When I think about that, I try to imagine what it would have been like if, a little bit like Back to the Future, if the genesis of film, a different sort of group was responsible for its development. It wasn't Hollywood. It was old people's homes. I don't know, something completely different. So that, the function of it was to ... not to entertain or to. So I think it's interesting to me to think about who is developing this work in its early stages and its purpose, and what that means in terms of how, where it goes. Like there could be, you can imagine an enormous amount of uses for virtual reality. It's sort of infinite, isn't it? But then, of course, what's his name, Birnbaum, and huge businesses will probably be the people making decisions about what's this most sort of profitable and valuable way to develop it, and that's probably not old people's homes. So, it's more than likely that these very important, useful functions of this new technology will be sidelined or remain in the realm of artists, and that's okay, I think. We just have to work out how to get more cash to the artists so that they're, on par a bit, and I think that's important. So the money bit's important. Where's the money come from? How can we get more of it? Stuff like that. Yeah.
James, you said at the top of the session about back-to-back, and I think the next section I wanted to talk about was, accessibility across all forms of the diversity spectrum, and I guess our community more broadly is an increasingly urgent concern within the arts, and the notion of empathy is also playing a very important role. So I guess for Zoe and James and indeed Natalie chip in as well, how is or how can technology be used to address the needs of artists and audiences with special access needs? And within that, I guess, how can it be used to challenge the practices and preconceptions and bias of artists and audiences who may not be familiar with experiences outside of their immediate circle? James, do you want to kick off?
Oh yeah, I mean, you can just imagine a person with difficulty with mobility, difficulty with their senses, difficulty with whatever. You know, the idea of the proliferation of experiences for that person has huge implications for, you know, them having equal access to interesting experiences in life. Not just equal access to being able to go to the doctor and being able to get on the train, but actually having equal access to a trippy game, or I guess I'm saying that I'm interested in the access not just to these sort of functional aspects of our day-to-day lives, but equal access to also poetic experiences. And I think that's the area, I think, where it's great that artists are involved in this stuff in the early stages, because access to poetic experiences is not necessarily high on our sort of national agenda. It could be. So that's one area I reckon is interesting to think about in terms of access. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in access in terms of more creating works that aren't tethered to a physical space, and the way that opens it up in terms of who can use or experience that work. So most recently I've been making work for kids. It's kind of like an extension of this interactive audio work, which is a multiplayer experience, and that's kind of, we're developing it as an app so that it's something that kids could play at home.
I saw it at the Sydney Writers' Festival. It was fantastic. Yeah.
So yeah, and it's like I was saying before, it's super lo-fi from the look of the thing, in that you tell the kids they need like 2 chairs and a blanket to be able to play this game. And then they put their headphones on and they're experiencing the story from their character's point of view, and it's kind of like an action adventure, and they build rafts and ride down rapids and things like that. So it opens up the potential in terms of being able to play at home and having that accessibility that's not place specific. So it's, they're using technology in that way is exciting for me on that level.
Cool. Do you have anything else, Natalie, or I've got a question for you next?
Sure, throw the question.
So throw the question. It was moving into, and you touched on it, I think, with your previous response about there's a lot of excitement, obviously, around the potential of technology as a more integrated part of everyday life, and but at the same time, there's a great sense of apprehension and fear towards it around ethical, implications. For example, issues around privacy and data collecting and mining and artificial intelligence. And I figured I'd like to sort of you to speak about how addressing or even embracing these ethical concerns and the disruption that sort of causes. And you spoke about, location-based content for the work that you're doing within AR, and I guess the relationship of that between access and ownership of digital space versus physical space. Yeah.
Yeah, so wow, where to begin?
Woo!
Yeah, I think that this is something that more people are aware of and should be aware of, especially in light of what's been happening with a lot of social media applications and what those companies have been doing with data that people may have not been aware of, even though they might have agreed to it in terms and conditions. And I think, and this is, I guess, part of the question that I had around funding earlier, is that a lot of people give up a sense of privacy or services because it's a free product, like Facebook and Twitter. These are all free products. And someone famously said that if you're getting something for free, it's because you are the product. So, but not just startups and entrepreneurs, but I think also perhaps in the art space, the audience and the content creator need to have a kind of discussion about who is funding these works and what are you prepared to pay for. The news media are looking at paywalls, but people still expect free news. So the idea of location and privacy, I feel, and in our company we feel as well, that we want to protect our users and what data they're giving up. So we will encrypt and decode certain pieces of information that anonymises all our data. So that's an active, decision that we're making. Yeah, so I think there's some responsibility on the developers, but I think there's a responsibility in the growing an awareness from the user's point of view as well. And I think that as it's still an early stage, these conversations are things that we need to have so that people are aware of it and not just blindly, signing up and downloading the next app without really realising what they're signing up to.
Did you guys have anything to add on that?
No, just imagining, could someone invent some technology that reads terms and services and processes them back, in a really cool way I could understand.
I mean, with your work, James, in prisons, I guess, obviously that could be viewed. I mean, we've seen a snippet of it in your introduction, obviously, but the sort of notion of space being in situ, and I've seen works in prisons, but then it would be a completely different experience, obviously, to see the work in a different setting.
Yeah. I've been dreaming about holographic work for ages, which is playing with the idea of legality, and putting myself more on the line. I mean, I've been working with all these people who've been in prison, but I think at some point I sort of have to come into contact with the law if this is my field. And I was thinking about how you could, play with the idea of the relativity of law. In Australia it's illegal to do this thing, but in another country it's legal. And place, film yourself doing something legal in that place, which is illegal in his place, and place me as a hologram doing it illegally here in Australia. I mean, it's a very sort of crude example, but the idea that through technology, we will be able to exist somehow in other spaces, practically even. I don't know if anyone saw Tupac at Coachella when he was dead. Does that ring any bells? Tupac is a rapper who died years ago but appeared at a festival as a hologram, but a pretty good hologram, And in 10, 15 years' time, that hologram will be much better, and we will see Tupac. You will maybe see me, performing some illegal activity on stage at Disrupted in 10 years from, Morocco, let's say. So the idea of sort of, multiplying our presence is fascinating to me through technology. Virtual reality doesn't really do that for me, but I'm sure that in time we will be able to do that. So it's good fun for me, and I look forward to being able to do stuff like that.
Actually, I'm just going to mention another example, which is more of the augmented reality space as opposed to VR, which is last year Snapchat worked with the American pop artist Jeff Koons to produce a 3D model and then place it in the middle of New York's Central Park, and which was interesting in itself from a technological point of view, but it actually created a lot of uproar in New York because people, said,
you can't do that.
Who has the right to do that in a public space? But it actually wasn't there. It was a virtual object that could only be seen when you were in a certain Snapchat filter. But it raises a really interesting point of this legality of who owns certain spaces. And what we were saying before, what if you could place your own artwork into the middle of Times Square, but you're competing against all those commercial interests who have actually paid for billboard space? And so I think you start challenging, the idea of real estate and space and ownership, which is really interesting.
It reminds me of the space race, stuff, building of weapons outside and outer space. Who was defining the ethics around that stuff? The military. Are they a good group of people to give that responsibility to? I don't think so. So why are they responsible for creating the ethics? Because they're simultaneously creating the technology. So the people who are creating the technology, you realise, are the people who are making the ethics. It's happening simultaneously. So unless we all step up and go, do we want Tupac on stage, and why not? Or do we want James, doing something illegal here at Disrupted Festival in overseas hologram? No. Why it's important to think about these things before they happen is because the people who will make the ethics are not the people that we think should be making those ethics, because they're going to have other interests, other vested interests.
I'm just going to do one question, and then I'll just get a steer if people have got some questions for our panel? Yes, okay, cool. So I'll just do one more question, and then we'll throw to the floor. I would like each of you to respond to the question, what is your fear if you don't embrace technology?
Well, probably going on from what James said, my fear is that if people who are interested in, creating empathetic experiences that allow people to communicate and be in touch with each other, if we don't create these experiences and embrace this technology, then who is going to, And they may not be as empathetic and sensitive to those human interests as we are. So.
Yeah, I'm just interested in terms of if you don't embrace technology, in terms of how that limits your work and that you're kind of boxing yourself into a practice that's kind of boundaries are very structured and set, and that the potential for what your work can be and how it can transform and connect with people, and that kind of humanity that can come from technology and using technology, if you don't engage with technology, really closing yourself off to that potential and that opportunity.
Yeah, I'm with you both on that. I think I'm searching for some meaningful fear here, and my fear is actually of embracing technology. And what I mean by that is, I've had the experience. I make music, and sometimes I work in computer. Sometimes I find myself editing a hi-hat sound for like 5 hours, getting the perfect, and I realise that's a big chunk of my life gone. And the hi-hat sound was not that big deal in the grand scheme of things. And so it leads me to think, my fear is that sort of diving into this virtual world, this technology world, that something that's very important to me, the sort of spiritual, physical experience of life, is diminished, and the time is taken from me. And I can't replicate, I'm pretty sure I can't replicate, maybe I'm wrong. I was going to say you can't replicate a spiritual experience through technology. That's probably wrong.
Well, it links back to your comments about the poetic, I think, and how you're using your role as an artist to influence, to make tech for good, if that makes sense, I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, as an artist, I think we should be able to make tech for, art for bad.
I've got a quote that you said in our pre-panel call, which, when you sort of responded to that, you sort of said, take hold of something and craft it into beauty, otherwise someone else might turn it into something shit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm just imagining, again, sort of military model, watch out, they're coming, they're going to take our beautiful VR and make a, gun dog or something. And, and I don't know, I think I'm more scared of using technology than of not using it. I think if we spend as much time investing sort of our imagination in the spiritual plane that is maybe happening between us now, which is not that different from looking at pixels and thinking about how, we develop a VR work. I think that's also dangerous, but it's just a fear. So. Yeah.
But then, is that investing that time on a spiritual level? Is that talking as a person or in terms of an artistic practice?
I'm a person. I'm real.
Oh no.
Yeah. You mean? I think so. I don't know now.
But
Stephen Hawking was saying that this is last idea was that we're a hologram, so it's possible. I don't think I catch you there.
Well, more that when you were talking about your hi-hat, I thought if your hi-hat did end up sounding 20% better,
it was good, yeah.
then it's kind of worth that 5 hours in terms of a pursuit of excellence and a pursuit of something that's kind of...
That's a very puritanical idea of art making, that the process is somehow so important and valuable to us all. I mean,
more the rigor and the time that you need to invest to create something that is... worth other people's time.
Exactly. Was the hi-hat worth it? I mean, I didn't even know which hi-hat it was. It's lost in the whole hundreds of thousands of hi-hats. I don't even know which one it is anymore. But I think I don't know. I don't think I'm with you on that.
I guess I'm just pushing back against. There's a lot of bad art in the world, and so I'm not opposed to spending.
You should
5
spend
hours
time on your hi-hat. Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
On that note, we'll throw to the floor. Have any of our audience members? There's one there, Amy.
It's more a statement than a question, but it might end up being a question. Firstly, thanks to the panel, really great discussion. And I thought I'd create a bit of context around that in Western Australia, and I hope I'm not speaking on behalf of Brendan. Is Brendan here from the concert hall, Perth Concert Hall. But anyway, there's a consortium of WA arts organisations and companies, probably about 20 of us, that have kind of banded together, and it has been driven by the Perth Concert Hall largely around accessing virtual reality technology as a group to apply in a range of ways. And interesting what you were saying, James. So, a lot of the discussions are around using it as a tool for people who might not normally access artistic experiences. And the examples that Brennan has given from the Perth Concert Hall and about in relation to WAZO is people who are housebound or in hospitals or in old, nursing homes, that they are able to experience a symphony orchestra concert in any seat they choose. This is sort of some of the dreams that we've been talking about, or experiencing it as if they were amongst the musicians on stage. So it's also about how you might experience a work from a way you may normally never be able to, even in reality. Perhaps at Pika, it being used as a kind of laboratory for artists, as and actually an artistic medium, the way that some of the examples that you gave Jeremy too. So that's quite exciting for us, and I feel that very much it's being driven from an artistic angle rather than a evil corporate one. But I guess the question at the end is to the panel is, what dreams would you have for such a venture? What are the kind of primary things that you'd want to see come out of such a venture?
My instinct is to be counterintuitive in those sort of questions, and I think giving it over to those groups or contexts which you think you wouldn't think of. I'm sure you can all think of some which you can't think of. Counterintuitive, it's weird like that, isn't it? But, I think, naturally you want to go into this glorious, aesthetically beautiful, compelling experiences. But, maybe it's an interesting thing to show soldiers war before they go to war, so they're less likely to shoot someone. Show them like someone's head exploding, or there's a lot of things to do with that sort of technology, which I think could be great. Shock people out of bad decisions. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm interested in it as what's a story that can be told that can only be told in that way, rather than taking existing art forms and putting them in headsets. Watching theatre shows or viewing art or something like that, that in a way that's kind of like a weird semi-innovation of you're taking something that already exists and you're kind of just showing it to people in a different way, and then how can we really create something new and think about what's a story that can only be told in this way, or in using VR or in this format. And yeah, that's a question that I really like to, whenever I kind of use technology, because it's such no, I won't say that. It's such an effort, and it's also so much can go wrong, and it's such a time sink in terms of the way that you make work and implement it into making work, that I like to always kind of underpin that work with asking the question of why does this story have to be told in this way? Why can't we just get up on a stage and tell it as a piece of theatre? And then if you can give a kind of an answer to that with conviction as to that this is a story that can only be told using this technology, then I think it's kind of a valid pursuit.
I think the thing that excites me are these collaborative experiences that we've talked about before that hasn't really emerged quite yet in VR. And one thing that I've heard of is group experiences in VR. So whether you could go to the concert, but you could attend the same concert with your friend in Finland at the same time, and you could choose seats next to each other and sit there almost in the same row, and when you turn to the right or the left you could see,
communicate with them,
avatars, and and perhaps even chat to each other or something. So those kinds of collaborative experiences I'm quite excited for. And I think the other thing is when we're working to build technology to make it more accessible for less abled people, I remember from working in web development and mobile app development, is you actually end up making it accessible even more accessible for everyone. Like if you make something easier to read, everyone can read it even when their screen's in full sunlight, or everyone can read subtitles even when they're on the bus and they're in a really noisy environment. So I think that's a really something that we can take from older technology but still apply to emerging technology, is those kinds of lessons.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, we've got probably time for this and one more question. Bear with us while the microphone hoons its way around. Thank you.
I suppose this is a question, but recently, I'll just give a little statement. I went to Kalgoorlie and then drove another 100 kilometres to go and see Anthony Gormley's work.
Oh, the Lake Ballard.
At Lake Ballard. So that fits into the category taking the art out of the gallery. I realise you've been talking about virtual reality, but getting back to this. And I had the pleasure of actually meeting Anthony Gormley quite indirectly. And basically what he did was he took pictures of Aboriginal people, manipulated the images, and then computer manipulation. Then he constructed the parts of the statues and then had them cast into stainless steel. So my question, I suppose, is where does that sort of art fit into this taking the art out of the gallery?
Well, it's such a broad spectrum, and we sort of curated the conversation based around the practice of each of our panel members here, but absolutely I was very fortunate to drive out and see that work as well, and it's a very incredible, and I guess that way that they engaged the community, and as you say, it scanned each member of, I think, Menzies community it was, and represented them back on the salt pans, and it was I'd been there not long after rain, and the whole experience of trekking across Lake Ballard knee-deep in mud and salt. But that's obviously another very incredible context of public art in different, very unique places. Do you guys have anything to respond to about that?
I want to see it. I'm going.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Kalgoorlie, so thanks for the tip.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably got time for one more question. Does anyone? Yes. We'll wait for the microphone. Oh, sorry. We're getting our poor.
While we wait for the microphone, I'm going to plug a film that's of mine.
I was going to, yes.
Showing. Oh, you're going to do it.
Well, no, I was going to say there's a few things coming up. We'll do it at the end. Yes. Hello. Oh.
I was just going to ask. You were saying taking out the gallery, and you go to a gallery, you see paintings which are hundreds of years old. How does the preservation of your works actually, into the future and all that? So you're creating using technology that may in 20 years' time not actually exist. So how does that fit in?
Just like my DVDs.
Yeah.
I've thought about that a little bit. I'm really interested in archiving. I worked for a company in Poland, a theatre company, who's one of the most impeccable, intense archivers of their own work. They didn't rely on anybody to do it. They did it all themselves, and they've got this amazing sort of treasure chest of their stuff. So I started doing that sort of out of inspiration. And I think it's sort of, given the nature of archiving in Australia, i.e. it's crap, artists sort of need to do that themselves. The galleries are not going to do our work, probably. So we have to do it ourselves. It's our responsibility, and I think that's all right, but it's not something that's taught to us, really.
No, it's interesting. There's a bit of a spike coming through Council's grants programs of documentation and archival-based activities run by artists, which I think is a really important thing for those to do, where there's sort of been significant bodies of work and artists are responding to those in the same way of actually sort of then documenting and preserving that huge body of work when you look at live art in Australia or any of those sorts of things as well. So.
It's a really interesting question, really interesting. Yeah.
We're backing up to the cloud.
But how do you handle it? Like the technology doesn't exist.
No, absolutely. That's something that we've, even, your own personal records, if you've got something on a 3.5 floppy disk, you can't really access it now, right? So, that, I guess because the technology is always changing, we're always looking at different file formats, and as each new technology changes, that's part of the creation process as well, is like, what's the best way to capture this and then document it and share it. So.
But do you feel something's lost in that process as well? Like, if you have something on a VHS tape, there was some quality about that maybe lost by digital or something like that. I don't know.
Oh no, have you tried watching
VHS will last longer than CD.
Yeah, right. We might have to wrap it up there. I think we've reached our time, but I was just going to say quickly to each of our panel members, upcoming plug. James, you said.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. A film, Willow, who's presenting Howl tonight with aphids and another bunch of amazing artists who are sitting over here, in Pika. Sold out, you can't go, but anyway. But Free is a film which we made in Finland, which is at 5:15, which is about the death of obsolete technology.
Yep.
It's 30 minutes. It's a score I wrote with some of the best death metal singers in Finland and a church choir, and it's pretty weird, pretty fun. Come have a look. It's free at 5:15.
Thank you.
Bring your phones.
Zoe, anything?
I've got films, a web series playing at Cinefest Oz towards the end of August down in Busselton. You can read all about it in the magazine in the Saturday paper today. So have a look.
Great.
It's called
Natalie?
Our
launching,
new app is called Drop It, and it will be available in the App Store in a few months' time. If you're interested in helping us test it, we're opening it up to a private beta, which means you get early access and get to play around with it. So,
Beta.
just get in touch. Yeah, beta.
James, Zoe and Natalie, thank you so much. Can we have a big round of applause for all of our speakers today, please? And I also wanted to just give a very special shout out to the State Library and thank them for continuing to run with Disrupted, and it's really important for these sorts of dialogues to happen and for free access to be sort of maintained as well. So thank you to the State Library and all the organisers, volunteers and everything. Thank you.